There is a planet in the Outer Rim that the Republic mostly ignored. The Jedi knew it existed. They filed reports on it. A handful of them went there and came back changed. A handful of them went there and did not come back at all. The planet sits in the Quelii sector, shrouded in perpetual mist, wrapped in dense forests that swallow sound, and it carries a name that most galactic citizens never had reason to say out loud: Dathomir. What lived on Dathomir was not a faction. It was not a cult in the way the Sith were a cult, with ranks and titles and a philosophy passed down through masters. What lived on Dathomir was something older than the Sith, something older than the Jedi, a tradition of force use that grew in isolation for thousands of years, without contact from the rest of the galaxy, without correction, without anything to tell it that what it was doing was wrong. And by the time the rest of the galaxy got a close look at it, the tradition had become something genuinely difficult to explain. The women who practiced it called themselves the Nightsisters. The men they ruled over called themselves the Night Brothers. And the magic they used was called magic, spelled with a K, as if to make very clear that this was not what happened in a Jedi temple. Before we get into any of that, we need to talk about the planet itself. Because Dathomir did not produce the Nightsisters. The Nightsisters produced themselves, but the planet absolutely shaped them, and you cannot understand what they became without understanding what they were living inside. If you are the kind of person who goes down rabbit holes at 2 in the morning looking for the darkest corners of Star Wars lore, you are in exactly the right place. Subscribe to the channel and hit the bell. Everything we cover here goes deep, and you do not want to miss what comes next. Dathomir is a terrestrial world. It is not a gas giant, not a desert, not an ice field. It has breathable atmosphere, running water, plant life, and animal life. On paper, it is habitable. In practice, it is one of the most hostile environments in the Outer Rim, not because of temperature or radiation or lack of oxygen, but because of what lives there. The planet's gravity is slightly higher than the galactic standard, not dramatically so, but enough. People who spent extended time on Dathomir without the right conditioning reported fatigue, joint pressure, and a constant low-grade physical weight that never fully went away. The Nightsisters were born into it. Their bodies adapted across generations. Visitors never quite adjusted. The forests cover most of the landmass. They are not forests like Kashyyyk, where individual trees reach miles into the sky in open groves. The forests of Dathomir are dense, layered, and dark. The canopy is thick enough in most regions to reduce midday sunlight to something closer to twilight. The ground is uneven, broken by rock formations and sudden elevation changes, by sinkholes and dry creek beds and places where the soil turns to something that is not quite mud and not quite stone. Moving through those forests quickly without knowing the terrain is how people died. The planet has 3 moons. That detail matters more than it sounds, because the Nightsisters organized their rituals and their calendar around those moons. The positioning of all 3 at once was significant. There were nights when all 3 were visible simultaneously, and those nights had specific names in Nightsister tradition. Specific things were done on those nights that were not done otherwise. The dominant animal life on Dathomir includes creatures that would qualify as apex predators almost anywhere else in the galaxy. Rancors are the most famous. They became famous partly because of what Jabba the Hutt kept in his basement. But on Dathomir, rancors are wild. They are native. They are not pets by default. The Nightsisters had a specific relationship with them that we will come back to. But the short version is this. The Nightsisters did not avoid rancors. They worked with them. They raised some of them. They viewed them as creatures deserving of respect, which tells you something about how the Nightsisters thought about power. They did not fear it. They tried to understand it and then stand next to it. Beyond rancors, the planet had sleeper spiders large enough to incapacitate a human in seconds. It had winged predators called Dathomirian hawks that nested in the upper canopy and hunted in coordinated groups. The water sources were full of things with teeth. A person dropped on Dathomir with no knowledge of the terrain, no weapons, and no local guidance had a life expectancy measured in hours. The Nightsisters had been navigating this for generations. The planet was not hostile to them. It was home. There is something specific to Dathomir that does not exist in precisely the same form anywhere else in the galaxy. The locals called it the green mist. It pooled in low areas. It gathered around the base of old trees, around certain rock formations, near bodies of standing water. It was not fog. It had a color to it, a faint luminescent green that became more visible at night. The Nightsisters knew where it gathered. They used specific locations where it was densest for their rituals. The origin of the green mist was connected to the Force, specifically to what the Nightsisters called magic. Dathomir was, in Force terms, a place where the boundary between the living and the dead was thinner than normal. That sounds like a metaphor, but in Star Wars lore, it is fairly literal. The planet had a concentration of dark side energy that went back further than any recorded history. And that energy had soaked into the ground, the water, the air. The green mist was one expression of it. Force-sensitive individuals who visited Dathomir often reported disturbing experiences, visions, sounds they could not identify, a feeling of being watched by something that was not physically there. Jedi who went to Dathomir on investigations frequently requested to leave before their assigned time was up. The few who stayed longer described it as a constant pressure, a weight that was not gravity but felt similar to it, something pushing against their connection to the Force and offering something else in its place. Most of them refused what was being offered. The Nightsisters, born there, raised there, had no framework for refusing it. For them, it was not a temptation, it was just the air. The Force does not work identically everywhere. This is not widely understood outside scholarly Jedi circles, and even within the Order, it was a contentious point. The dominant Jedi view was that the Force was singular, universal, present in all living things equally. But that was an ideological position as much as an empirical one. What the Jedi called the dark side of the Force was concentrated on certain worlds. Moraband, Malachor, Exegol. These were places where the dark side had pooled, where the history of what happened there had left a mark that sensitive individuals could feel centuries or millennia later. Dathomir belonged in that category, though it was different from the others. Moraband was the Sith graveyard. Malachor was the site of a catastrophic ancient battle. Exegol was deliberately engineered. Dathomir was none of those things. Dathomir's dark side concentration was organic. It grew there. It was not the result of a single event. It was the accumulation of thousands of years of Force use by a group of people who drew on that energy consistently, who performed rituals that fed back into it, who lived and died and were buried there generation after generation. The Nightsisters did not think of what they practiced as the dark side. They did not use that terminology at all. They called it magic. They called the energy they drew on the winged goddess and the fanged god, two spiritual concepts that mapped loosely onto the light and dark side dichotomy, but were not identical to it. In Nightsister theology, these were not opposite forces at war with each other. They were two aspects of a single power that the Nightsisters learned to access and channel. This distinction matters. The Sith relationship with the dark side was one of consumption, aggression, and personal domination. The Nightsister relationship with their magic was communal, ritualized, and tied to the land. It had more in common with what anthropologists studying isolated cultures might call shamanism than it did with what the Sith were doing. There were sacrifices, there were initiations, there were specific songs and specific tools and specific places. There was a collective memory of technique passed down from mother to daughter across uncountable generations. And through all of that, the Dathomir Force tradition developed capabilities that the Jedi and Sith had nothing equivalent to. The most widely known Nightsister ability was the reanimation of the dead. This is the one that tends to make people sit up straight. The Nightsisters could take dead tissue and restore animation to it. Not life, not exactly, but motion, coordination, purpose. A Nightsister who was sufficiently skilled, using the right ritual process, could raise the dead bodies of fallen warriors and use them as soldiers. The bodies retained physical capability. They could fight. They could carry weapons. They did not speak, did not reason, did not disobey. They moved because the magic moved them. The Jedi had no doctrine for this. The Sith had touched it, in their own way, through the concept of essence transfer and body preservation through the Force. But what the Nightsisters did was different. It was not about preserving a consciousness or transferring a soul. It was about animating tissue. It was closer to what a puppeteer does than what a philosopher does. Mother Talzin was the most powerful practitioner of this in known Nightsister history, and we will spend a long time on her. But the capability itself was not unique to her. It was part of the tradition. It was taught. Second on the list was transformation. Nightsisters could alter physical matter using magic. The most famous application of this was what was done to Savage Opress, who was not born with his size, his strength, or the physical monstrousness he displayed by the time he became Dooku's apprentice. He was transformed. A ritual was performed on him that used the Force energy of Dathomir to reshape his body. This was not a metaphor. His muscle mass increased substantially. His aggression became something beyond the normal range of Zabrak biology. His pain tolerance reached a point where he could absorb impacts that would have killed an unaltered Zabrak. The transformation rituals carried costs. They were not clean procedures. Not everyone who was subjected to them survived. Of the group of Night Brothers brought in for the selection process before Savage was chosen, several did not make it through the night. Third was projection. Nightsisters could create illusions and phantoms with physical presence, not just visual effects. Mother Talzin's gold conjuring, where she projected physical spears and weapons made of Force energy through a medium that looked like animated fog, was one variant of this. Another was the ability to cast a locating spell, to find a specific individual across vast distances by creating a surrogate of them from their biological material. This is the technique she used to track Dooku later in the war. She needed a piece of him, something physical, a strand of hair, a drop of blood. From that, she built a voodoo construct, a surrogate made of material from Dathomir, and through that surrogate, she could locate him anywhere in the galaxy and eventually pull him toward her or project agony into him from a distance. The Jedi had no analog for this either. Fourth was what could only be called spirit work. The boundary between the living and the dead on Dathomir was genuinely permeable in a way it was not elsewhere. Nightsisters communicated with what they called spirits, entities that had passed through death but remained accessible to the living under the right conditions. Whether these were Force ghosts in the Jedi sense, echoes of past practitioners, or something else entirely was never conclusively established. But the interactions were real and functional. Information passed both ways. The story of the Nightsisters does not begin with a dramatic founding moment. It does not begin with a single leader who decided to build a new tradition. It began with abandonment. The very first Force-sensitive humans on Dathomir were not native to the planet. They were brought there or arrived there from elsewhere. The accepted lore suggests that Dathomir was colonized at some point in the deep past by Force-sensitive humans who were exiled from the rest of the galaxy. Some accounts describe them as rogue Jedi who were expelled from the Order for practicing forbidden techniques. Others suggest they were exiled by a republic that had no Jedi structure at the time and simply wanted the Force-sensitive troublemakers gone. The planet itself was considered a prison world for a significant period of galactic history. The Republic placed a quarantine around it. The hyperspace coordinates were difficult to access, and the planet was not on standard navigational charts. If you were sent to Dathomir, you were not coming back. That was the point. The original exiles had no support, no supply line, no communication with the rest of the galaxy. They had the planet, each other, and whatever they could develop. The ones who survived were the Force-sensitive ones, because the magic of Dathomir responded to them in ways it did not respond to others. The ones who figured out how to work with the planet's dark side energy could do things that dramatically improved survival odds. They could find water. They could communicate with rancors. They could feel when predators were nearby before the predators arrived. A culture organized around Force use was the only culture that made sense to develop on that planet. The male and female populations diverged at some point in the tradition's history. The women became the practitioners and the holders of the magic. The men became physically formidable, but were largely excluded from the deeper practice. Whether this was a deliberate decision at some early point, or whether it emerged gradually through cultural drift, is not fully established. What is established is that by the time Dathomir was rediscovered by the wider galaxy, the social structure was rigid. Women led, men served. The Nightsisters and the Night Brothers were not the same community. They had separate villages, separate social rules, separate hierarchies. The Nightsisters lived in communal structures in the forests. The Night Brothers occupied a different area entirely and were summoned when the Nightsisters needed warriors, laborers, or the occasional breeding partner. The Night Brothers had their own culture and their own pride, but they did not rule anything. The Nightsisters chose when the Night Brothers were relevant and when they were not. The Night Brother warriors were genuinely terrifying on their own merits. The Dathomirian Zabrak, the subspecies that populated the Night Brother clans, were heavier muscled and more aggressive than standard Zabrak. Their horns were more pronounced, their facial tattoo patterns were more elaborate and carried specific cultural meaning. A grown Night Brother warrior was a match for almost any soldier in the galaxy, even before Nightsister enhancement entered the picture. Darth Maul came from here. We will spend a great deal of time on that. The Nightsisters were not a monolithic group. They were organized into clans, each with its own territory and its own mother, the title given to the clan leader. The title of mother was not merely honorific, it was functional. The mother of a clan was the most powerful Force practitioner in that group, the keeper of the deepest ritual knowledge, and the final decision-maker on everything from diplomacy to execution. Different clans had different specializations. Some focused heavily on the combat applications of magic. Some were known more for their healing practices. Some maintained the death rituals, the preservation of knowledge from past generations, the communication with the spirits of Nightsisters who had died but whose knowledge was too valuable to lose. The clans could cooperate, and they could conflict. History records periods of inter-clan warfare on Dathomir that were brutal even by the standards of a society that lived with rancors and faced death by prehistoric animals on a regular basis. A mother who miscalculated politically could end up facing another clan's army of reanimated dead. That was not a metaphorical threat. That was a documented outcome. The most significant clan in recorded Nightsister history was the one led by Mother Talzin, who was not only the most powerful individual practitioner, but the closest thing Dathomir ever had to a unifying leader. Under her influence, the various clans moved toward at least a degree of coordination that they had not achieved before. She did not eliminate the clan structure. She worked through it. She became, in effect, the mother of mothers, the acknowledged leader of the planet without formally abolishing the autonomy of individual clans. How she achieved that position is part of the larger story of her life, which is long, strange, and genuinely one of the most significant individual histories in Star Wars canon. There is not a lot that is known about Talzin's earliest years. What is known is that she was born on Dathomir to a Nightsister clan, that she showed Force sensitivity early and powerful enough to draw the attention of her elders, and that she was trained in the Nightsister tradition from childhood. What first distinguishes her in the records is the moment her path intersected with Darth Sidious. The timing is somewhere around 40 to 50 BBY, which puts it well before the Clone Wars, well before Sidious had achieved the political maneuvering that would eventually make him Emperor. At this point, he was Darth Sidious in secret and Sheev Palpatine, Senator from Naboo, in public. But he was already working through layers of manipulation that most of the galaxy could not see. Sidious came to Dathomir. The specific circumstances vary by source, but the core of what happened is consistent. He came, he met Talzin, and he spent time there learning about Nightsister magic. The Force tradition on Dathomir was genuinely novel to him. The Sith knew about Dathomir in the abstract, the way any sufficiently old Sith tradition would accumulate records about other Force-using groups. But Sidious had a specific and personal interest in what Talzin was doing. Their relationship during this period was, by any reasonable reading, one of mutual fascination. Talzin found him formidable. Sidious found her knowledge base unlike anything in his experience. What happened between them included, according to various accounts, something more intimate than a scholarly exchange. Exactly what shape that took in the lore is ambiguous, but the consequence is not. Talzin became pregnant. The child that resulted from this was Maul. Sidious did not stay. He made an agreement with Talzin, or something that looked like an agreement from the outside. He told her he would take her with him as his apprentice. He told her the child would be taken and trained. What actually happened was that Sidious took the child and left without taking Talzin. Whether he intended to take her and changed his mind, whether it was a betrayal from the beginning, or whether there was some exchange between them that ended differently than Talzin expected, the result was the same. She was left on Dathomir. Her son was taken, and she carried that fact with her for the next several decades with a precision and a patience that was genuinely remarkable. This is the thread that runs under most of the significant events in Nightsister history during the Clone Wars. Talzin had a son who did not know he was her son. She had an enemy who had taken him. She had a planet full of tools and knowledge, and she had time. Maul was taken from Dathomir as an infant or very young child. By the time he has any consciousness of his own history, he is being trained by Sidious. His training was not what Jedi training looked like. The Sith rule of two, Darth Bane's doctrine, which Sidious followed, meant there was one master and one apprentice. No parallel training, no academy. Maul's entire world, from the moment he had a world, was Sidious. The methods Sidious used were conditioning as much as teaching. They were designed to produce a weapon, not a person. Maul was exposed to pain, to isolation, to combat challenges that were intended to strip away everything except capability and obedience. He was tattooed across his entire body. The Dathomirian Zabrak pattern of his heritage extended and modified into something that covered him completely, which was Sidious's deliberate choice. Whether Maul understood what those markings meant in the original cultural context is unknown. He was removed from that context before he could have learned it. What Maul became through this process was extraordinary from a pure combat standpoint. His connection to the Force was strong. His mastery of the lightsaber, specifically the double-bladed form he developed, reached a level that even the Jedi Council would eventually acknowledge as elite. His aggression was not a weakness in his approach. It was engineered. Sidious wanted an instrument of directed violence, and that is what he built. But something was left out. Something that Talzin, watching from Dathomir, would have recognized immediately if she had seen him trained. Maul was never taught what he was. He was never given a story about himself, about his mother, about the planet he came from. He was given a role and a master and a purpose, and nothing else. That absence would matter later. It mattered enormously. When Sidious deployed Maul as an instrument during the events around the trade dispute with Naboo, Maul was a weapon at full deployment. The encounter with Qui-Gon Jinn on Tatooine was brief and inconclusive, but it was the first time in living memory that a Sith had shown themselves openly to the Jedi. The Order was shaken. Two Sith working in the open after the Rule of Two had kept them hidden for 1,000 years was a signal that something had changed in Sidious's plans. The confrontation at the end of the Naboo crisis was when Maul's story took the turn that everyone knows. He killed Qui-Gon Jinn. He was cut in half by Obi-Wan Kenobi. He fell into a reactor pit on Naboo. From the galaxy's perspective, Darth Maul was dead. From Sidious's perspective, the weapon had been destroyed and a new one would need to be built, which led eventually to Dooku. From the Jedi's perspective, the threat was over. None of those perspectives were correct. What happened to Maul after the reactor pit is one of the strangest survivals in Star Wars lore, and it connects directly to what he was. He was Dathomirian Zabrak. He carried in his biology, even without knowing it, something of the resilience that came from Dathomir. His connection to the dark side of the Force was powerful enough to sustain him through what should have been a fatal injury. His body regenerated the lower half, replacing it with a crude spider-like mechanical apparatus that he constructed in a kind of semi-conscious fugue state on a garbage dump world called Lotho Minor. What he did not retain was his sanity, at least not fully. The years between Naboo and his eventual rescue were a period of deterioration. He built a mechanical lower body. He survived on whatever he could catch and consume. His mind fractured. He retained fragments of rage and memory, but lost the coherence that Sidious had trained into him. He was not dead. He was broken. It was Talzin who found him. It was the Nightsisters who brought him back. The fact that Talzin located Maul at all is worth pausing on. He had been on Lotho Minor for roughly a decade. He had no contact with anyone. He had not communicated with Dathomir. He had not attempted to contact Sidious. He was simply there, surviving in a degraded state. She found him because the biological connection between a mother and a child is, within Nightsister magic, a locating mechanism. She used the craft she had been developing for decades. She found him the way the Nightsisters found things, through the Force, through ritual, through the kind of knowledge the rest of the galaxy did not have. What she sent was Savage Opress. Savage's role here was as a recovery agent, essentially. He was sent to Lotho Minor with instructions to find Maul and bring him home. What he found was not what he expected. A fragment of the warrior he had heard stories about, the Sith's apprentice who had killed a Jedi Master, was now crouching in garbage, speaking in riddles, held together by crude metal and barely contained hysteria. Savage brought him back to Dathomir anyway. The restoration ritual that Talzin performed on Maul was one of the most significant demonstrations of what Nightsister magic could do at its highest level. She rebuilt his mind, not from scratch. She worked with what was there, the memory, the training, the capacity. But she knit the fragments back into something coherent. She also replaced his mechanical lower half with proper Nightsister crafted prosthetics, the kind that could support combat movement. The ritual required physical sacrifice on her part. She spent power. She did not advertise this, but the exertion of restoring Maul was visible to anyone paying attention. This was not a simple healing. This was Talzin reaching into her own reserves and pouring them into someone else. Why she did this, given what Sidious had done to her, given that she had been waiting for decades in something that looked from the outside like patience but was closer to a controlled fury, was because Maul was her son. That part of it was not political. It was not strategic, at least not purely. She wanted him back because he was hers, and Sidious had taken him, and restoring him was one part of a longer accounting she intended to collect. The Clone Wars brought outside forces to Dathomir in a way that the planet had not experienced in centuries. Count Dooku's role in this was, characteristically, one of manipulation. Talzin had provided Dooku with savage oppress, transformed and enhanced as his new apprentice following the end of Ventress's usefulness. That transaction had been arranged with specific expectations on Talzin's part. She expected Dooku to honor certain understandings. He did not. Dooku's relationship with Talzin was one of mutual use, which is an accurate description of almost all of Dooku's relationships. He used what she offered. When it became inconvenient, or when Sidious applied pressure, he moved against her. That move came in the form of General Grievous and a separatist army deployed to Dathomir. What followed was the massacre of the Nightsisters. This is one of the most viscerally devastating events in Clone Wars canon, and it deserves the attention it receives. Grievous led the assault personally. His army was mechanical and overwhelming. The Nightsisters fought back with everything they had. Talzin raised an army of the dead. Dead Nightsisters pulled themselves out of the ground and took up arms against the droids. The green mist moved through the battlefield. Nightsister magic at full deployment was terrifying to witness, and it was not enough. Grievous's forces were too many. The droid army did not feel fear, did not react to darkness or mist or the horror of fighting the reanimated dead. They processed targets and fired. The Nightsisters fell. The village was destroyed. The dead army, without the practitioners sustaining it, eventually went still. By the end of the battle, the Nightsisters of Dathomir were almost entirely gone. A handful survived in isolated locations. Mother Talzin herself was not captured or killed in the assault, but the community she had spent her life building was ash. This event changed the character of what the Nightsisters were in the galaxy's story. Before the massacre, they were a living tradition with continuity, a culture with ongoing practice. After it, they were almost exclusively history. The few survivors carried what they knew, but there was no longer a community to pass it to in the normal way. What had taken thousands of years to build was destroyed in one afternoon. No account of the Nightsisters is complete without spending real time on Asajj Ventress. She is one of the most complex characters the Star Wars franchise produced during the Clone Wars era, and her connection to Dathomir runs deeper than most casual viewers realize. Ventress was born on Dathomir. She was Nightsister by birth, the biological daughter of a Nightsister mother. But she did not grow up on Dathomir. She was given away as an infant. The specific circumstances involved a debt. A Nightsister named Kai Narek No, let the record be corrected. Ventress's mother gave her to a criminal group called the Halifu to settle a debt, and she was eventually found by a Jedi named Kai Narek, who had been stranded on the world Ratatak. Kai Narek became her master. He trained her in the Jedi way. She developed genuine skill and genuine connection to him. Then he was killed. He was killed in combat during the chaos of Ratatak's constant warfare, and Ventress did what anyone might do when the only stable point in their life is violently removed. She drew on the rage and the grief and the loss. She was already Force-sensitive. The dark side was available. She reached for it. Dooku found her on Ratatak, a one-woman army who had turned the war there into her personal project of sustained revenge. He saw capability and he saw anger that could be shaped. He took her as his apprentice, not quite in the rule of two sense, but as a dark side instrument, an assassin, a commander. Ventress was, by any measure, formidable. Her double lightsaber technique was her own development, aggressive and off-balance in a way that created genuine difficulty for Jedi opponents. Her Force capability was strong. Her tactical instincts were sharp. She was not a Sith in the doctrinal sense, but she was functioning at a level where the distinction was mostly academic. What ended her position with Dooku was Sidious. Sidious determined that Ventress had grown too powerful. In the Sith tradition, an apprentice who became sufficiently capable became a threat to the master. Sidious ordered Dooku to eliminate her. Dooku characteristically complied without apparent regret. He tried to have her killed during a battle where she was supposed to receive support. The support did not come. She was left to face a superior force alone and nearly died. She did not die. And this is where Dathomir re-enters her story. She went home. She had never lived there. She had no memory of the planet from childhood, but she was Nightsister, biologically and by birth, and the planet recognized her in the way Dathomir tended to recognize its own. She arrived half dead, furious, and without a plan. Talzin received her. What Talzin gave Ventress was identity. For the first time in her adult life, Ventress understood what she was and where she came from. She went through the Nightsister initiation rituals. She was recognized by the community. The women of her clan accepted her. She received her white robes and the curved red lightsabers that were standard Nightsister combat tools, and she sat with her people around their fires and listened to what they knew. This period did not last long before events pushed her back out into the larger conflict. But it mattered. Ventress after Dathomir was different from Ventress before it. The loss she had carried since Kai Narek died had a context now. She knew what she was, even if she was not sure what she intended to do with that knowledge. The arc she traveled from there, eventually towards something that looked less like a Sith and more like an independent operator making choices about what she would and would not do, was one of the Clone Wars' most quietly impressive character developments. She ended up in the novel Dark Disciple, fighting on the side of the Republic when circumstances put her there, not because she had become righteous, because Dooku was a specific enemy and the Republic was a specific tool, and because somewhere in the process of all of it, she had developed something that resembled principles. She died protecting Quinlan Vos, a Jedi she had been sent to corrupt, and who she had instead come to love, in the complicated way that people who have been through destruction together sometimes do. She died willingly. It was not dramatic self-sacrifice theater. It was a choice she made, knowing the cost. For a woman who began as a debt to be paid, that ending says something. We have mentioned the Night Brothers throughout, but have not stopped to look at them properly. The history of the Night Brothers is largely the history of people who existed in relation to other people's stories, which is part of what makes it worth examining separately. The Night Brother clans occupied the far side of Dathomir from the Nightsister villages. They were not in constant contact. They were not integrated. The social structure that had developed over thousands of years of isolation had produced a rigid separation. Night Sisters held power. Night Brothers supplied what Night Sisters needed from males, which was primarily physical labor and combat capability when required. This system was not experienced the same way by everyone within it. Some Night Brothers appear in the accounts as genuinely proud of their position, warriors who found meaning in their physical culture, in combat training, in the elaborate tattoo traditions that marked rank and achievement. The Dathomirian Zabrak had their own codes, their own tests, their own hierarchy. None of that was imposed by the Night Sisters. It developed in the Night Brother community as an expression of what the men valued when left to organize themselves. Other Night Brothers chafed against the system. They knew that their access to the deeper magic was denied, that no matter how capable they became, the structure of power on Dathomir placed them permanently below the women. For the ones who felt this acutely, it was a source of suppressed rage that could not be addressed within the existing framework. Savage Opress was selected from the Night Brothers specifically because Talzin needed a warrior. The selection process was brutal, a competition that the Night Brothers were told was an honor, which it was in some sense, but which was also genuinely dangerous. Several Night Brothers died during the selection tests. Savage won. What was done to him afterward with the enhancement rituals was not something he chose with full information. He was told he was being given power. He was not told what the process involved or what it would cost him. The transformation made him physically extraordinary. It also stripped away some of what made him human adjacent in his behavior. The rage that was always there became more constant and less controlled. Savage's arc through the Clone Wars was, in its own way, as tragic as his brothers. He was powerful, and he was used. He served Asajj Ventress until her path changed. He served Dooku briefly and was discarded. He served Maul and died for it, killed by Sidious in a demonstration of who was in charge. He was never the story. He was a powerful man who existed in the margins of more famous people's stories, which is, with only slight exaggeration, the story of every Night Brother in recorded history. A Night Sister child born into the clan was not automatically a full member of the community. Membership was earned through specific initiations that marked the transition from girlhood to full practitioner status. The details of the initiation rituals varied somewhat between clans and across time periods, but the general structure was consistent. A girl who had demonstrated sufficient force sensitivity and sufficient maturity was brought forward, typically in her early teens, for a trial period. During this period, she had to demonstrate command of at least the foundational magic practices, the ability to feel and channel the ichor, the basic ritual knowledge, the capacity to communicate with the spirits of the dead in at least the most limited sense. The physical element of the initiation was not cosmetic. Night Sisters lived in an environment that required genuine physical capability, and the initiation included challenges that tested endurance, pain tolerance, and the capacity to function under fear. The animal life of Dathomir was sometimes used in this context, not in the way of deliberately traumatizing a child, but in the way of putting her in a situation where she had to manage herself without immediate adult intervention and find out what she was made of. The successful initiates emerged into full clan membership with a different status than they had before. They wore specific markings. They were granted access to knowledge that had been withheld during their training period. They could participate in the full ritual calendar, including the more demanding practices around death and reanimation that younger practitioners were not brought into. The unsuccessful ones were not simply failed and returned to an ordinary life. The Night Sister community had no ordinary life to return to. A girl who could not pass the initiation was a problem the community had to solve in its own way. Some accounts suggest such individuals were given limited roles, support positions that did not require full magic command. Others suggest outcomes that were more final. The harshness of this was not cruelty for its own sake. It was the logic of a community that had been surviving on a hostile world through the specific capability of its members. A Night Sister who could not command the magic was, in the strict calculation of survival, a liability in a community where every full member had to be able to defend herself and contribute to the group's defense. The calculus was brutal. It was also the calculus of a community that had kept itself alive for thousands of years without outside support. Talzin's management of the Night Brother population was one of the under-examined dimensions of her leadership. She was not simply extracting labor and warriors from the Night Brothers and discarding them when done. She was maintaining a political relationship with a population that had its own pride, its own culture, and its own capacity for rebellion, if sufficiently provoked. The Night Brothers were not chattel. They were a separate community with their own hierarchy. The clan mother of the Night Brothers, technically a subordinate position in the larger Dathomir power structure, held real authority within the male community and had to be managed rather than simply commanded. Talzin's approach was one of strategic respect. She acknowledged Night Brother achievements. She honored the combat culture in specific ways that cost her nothing and returned significant social capital. She did not micromanage what happened in the Night Brother villages. She intervened when intervention was necessary and otherwise maintained the relationship from a distance. When she needed something specific, she approached it as a negotiation, or at least as something that looked enough like a negotiation that Night Brother pride was preserved. The selection process for Savage, for instance, was framed as an honor for the Night Brothers, as a competition that would identify the greatest warrior among them and elevate him to a significant role. This framing was not false exactly. Savage was elevated. What was not fully disclosed was what the elevation would cost him. The Night Brother leaders who participated in the selection process were not stupid. They knew that Talzin did not arrange something as elaborate as a warrior competition without serious intent behind it. They cooperated because the alternative, refusing Talzin's request outright, was not a position they could sustain. She was too powerful. The Night Sisters were too embedded in the control of Dathomir. The Night Brothers could resist at the cost of a conflict they would not win. Or they could cooperate and extract whatever social benefit was available from the arrangement. This dynamic was stable for centuries before it ended in massacre. The Night Brother population survived the massacre better than the Night Sisters did, largely because the attack was specifically targeted at the Night Sister village rather than the entire planet's population. Night Brothers who stayed away from the active fighting during the assault survived. Their community persisted, damaged and diminished, but not annihilated. What the Night Brothers did with their survival in the years afterward is a part of Dathomir's post-Clone Wars history that is not fully documented. They had their culture, they had their planet. They did not have the Night Sisters managing the relationship anymore. Whether that absence was, from the Night Brother perspective, a loss or a liberation is a question the lore raises without cleanly answering. Count Dooku was a man of enormous self-regard and genuine capability, and his relationship with Dathomir was characteristically one in which he believed himself to be the superior party, using a resource. He was wrong about that. He was often wrong in that specific way. His first real engagement with the Night Sisters came through Asajj Ventress, who he had recruited and trained without knowing or particularly caring about her actual origins. When the Night Sister connection became relevant, Dooku's response was that of a man filing information away for potential use. He was not interested in Dathomir's traditions. He was not curious about Night Sister magic in any philosophical sense. He wanted tools, and Talzin was offering tools in exchange for something. The something she was offering in the beginning was Ventress's continued service. Talzin did not simply give Ventress to Dooku. She positioned herself as a resource provider, as a woman with access to capable dark side practitioners who could be of use to the separatist cause. Dooku understood that framing. He operated within it for a time. The first major crack came when Sidious ordered him to kill Ventress. Dooku obeyed. This was the correct move within Sith doctrine. An apprentice who becomes too powerful is a threat to the master. Sidious's order was textbook, but it violated the understanding Dooku had with Talzin, which was that Ventress was under her protection, as well as his command. Dooku did not inform Talzin. He did not renegotiate. He simply acted, which told Talzin everything she needed to know about how much his word was worth. The replacement arrangement, where Talzin provided Savage Opress as the new apprentice, was a test as much as it was a service. She wanted to see how Dooku handled the new asset. She knew Savage was hers in a way that Dooku did not fully grasp. She had transformed him. She had put something of Dathomir into him along with the enhanced strength. If Dooku mistreated him, she would know about it. If Dooku discarded him as casually as he had moved to discard Ventress, she would have confirmation of what kind of person she was dealing with. Dooku discarded Savage when Maul's return changed the situation. He did so without ceremony, without acknowledgement of what Savage had done in his service. This too went into Talzin's accounting. The attempt to capture Dooku during the Clone Wars, using the surrogate and the locating magic and Maul as the primary operative, came close. The plan required Dooku to be brought to a specific place at a specific time. It required the Night Sister magic to work at range across a galactic distance. It required timing and coordination across multiple layers. Most of it worked. The part that failed was the part that Sidious made fail, because Sidious had anticipated Talzin moving in exactly this direction and had positioned Grievous to intervene. Dooku, throughout all of this, never fully understood that he had been the subject of a long-running plan for most of his interaction with Dathomir. He thought he was using Talzin. She thought he was useful until he wasn't. The gap between those two assessments was significant. The Night Sisters are not alone in Star Wars lore as a Force tradition that does not fit cleanly into the Jedi-Sith framework. Understanding them in that broader context makes them more interesting, not less. The Witches of Dathomir, as the Night Sisters were sometimes called by outsiders, were the most developed of these alternative traditions in terms of the depth of their portrayal. But they shared the category with several other groups. The Guardians of the Wills on Jedha were a Force tradition that had diverged significantly from the Jedi while sharing some roots. Their practices were devotional and protective rather than combat-focused, though some among them were formidable fighters. The Jedi relationship with them was complicated and not uniformly respectful. The Lasats had a Force tradition connected to the Ashla, which was their word for what others called the Force. But their relationship with it was distinct. It was navigational, intuitive, tied to their specific biology and culture in ways that made it difficult to translate into Jedi practice. The Matukai were a smaller group who practiced a Force tradition focused on the body, on physical conditioning as the medium through which Force attunement was achieved. They drew on both sides of the Force, but in a disciplined, integrated way that the Jedi acknowledged as legitimate, even while not fully endorsing. What all of these groups share with the Night Sisters, and what they illuminate about the Night Sisters' place in the larger story, is that the Force is bigger than either major institutional tradition. The Jedi and the Sith both acted in different ways as if they had a complete understanding of what the Force was and what it meant. Neither of them did. The existence of alternative traditions was evidence of that incompleteness. The Night Sisters, specifically, demonstrated that a dark side tradition could sustain a community across millennia without the degenerative cycle that characterized the Sith. The Sith kept destroying themselves, kept fracturing into civil war, kept producing practitioners who turned on each other. The Nightsisters maintained a community, whatever costs their tradition imposed, whatever darkness it drew on. It produced a culture that lasted, that is worth noting. And it is worth noting precisely because it complicates the simple moral framework that the Jedi liked to apply to anything that touched the dark side. The Night Brothers were not simply humans who lived on Dathomir. They were Dathomirian Zabrak, a subspecies that had developed specific characteristics over the generations they had spent on the planet. Standard Zabrak, the broader species of which they were a variant, already had a reputation for durability and aggression. They had evolved on a homeworld called Iridonia that had its own environmental challenges, and their biology reflected that. The Zabrak nervous system was configured for higher pain tolerance than most humanoid species. Their second heart was a backup system that improved survival odds in situations that would have been fatal for species with single cardiac function. They healed faster than standard humans. The Dathomirian variant added layers to all of this. The higher gravity of Dathomir had, over generations, produced denser bone structure and more robust musculature. The constant physical demands of survival in that environment had further selected for individuals who could take punishment and keep functioning. The tattooing tradition that covered the Night Brothers' faces and bodies was not purely decorative. The specific pigments used in the traditional ink had properties that helped the skin manage Dathomir's specific radiation environment. Maul was all of this, and then something more. Sidious had trained him from infancy, which meant his body had been pushed through conditioning programs that even a standard Zabrak would have struggled with. The double-bladed lightsaber form he developed was specifically designed around the Dathomirian Zabrak physiology. The speed, the multi-plane attack capability, the capacity for sustained aggressive engagement that a heavier but less maneuverable opponent could not easily counter. His tattoo pattern was extended by Sidious beyond what any Night Brother would have worn. The full-body coverage was Sidious's design. Whether Maul ever understood the cultural meaning of the partial tattoos he would have worn had he grown up on Dathomir, and what it meant to him to instead wear a total coverage that was someone else's artistic statement on his body, is one of the more quietly disturbing elements of his background. He was marked from infancy as someone else's property. The tattoos were the physical expression of that marking. He wore them his entire life without, for a long time, knowing what they actually were or where they came from. The Nightsisters organized significant portions of their communal life around a calendar tied to Dathomir's moons and the positions of the planet's sun. The rituals that took place on specific calendar dates were not optional cultural ceremonies. They were functional practice, maintenance of the relationship between the community and the force energy of the planet. The Great Moon Alignment happened when all three of Dathomir's moons reached specific positions relative to each other and to the planet. This was rare, occurring only a few times in each generation, and the Nightsisters treated the alignment as the most powerful ritual window available to them. Major workings were scheduled for these dates: transformations, major healings, communications with the deepest levels of the spirit network. The reanimation of a specific individual, as opposed to the mass raising of an army of recent dead, was best performed during certain moon phases. The ichor flowed more freely. The spirits were more accessible. Results that would have required extreme effort during an unfavorable phase were achievable with less expenditure during a favorable one. The planting and harvest cycle, insofar as the Nightsisters maintained agriculture alongside their more dramatic practices, was also ritually marked. Dathomir's ecosystem was hostile, but it was not barren. The Nightsisters cultivated specific plants that had ritual uses, the components of spell bottles, medicinal compounds, pigments for tattooing, materials for the construction of the clay surrogate figures used in locating magic. There were also observances for the dead. These were not single ceremonies. They occurred at specific intervals, following a death, and then at annual commemorations. The connection between the living community and the dead, who remained accessible through Dathomir's force saturation, was maintained through these observances. They were not mournful occasions in the way an outsider might have expected. They were more like regular check-ins, communication with relatives who had moved into a different state of existence but had not gone away. The massacre destroyed the ability to maintain this calendar. The survivors could remember the dates, but the rituals required practitioners, and the practitioners were gone. One of the things Merrin carried was the awareness that the dead were not being properly attended to. The unrest on Dathomir after the massacre was partly the consequence of that absence. The Night Sister villages were not primitive. This is a point worth making directly, because the tendency when encountering a culture that uses practices labeled as witchcraft is to assume technological simplicity. The Night Sister structures were adapted to the forest environment in sophisticated ways. The buildings incorporated living wood, woven and shaped through both conventional construction technique and force-aided growth direction. Over time, a well-maintained Night Sister structure merged with the surrounding forest, becoming part of the ecosystem rather than an imposition on it. This made the villages harder to locate from the air, harder to assault, and significantly more durable than conventional construction. The interiors of these structures reflected a culture with accumulated knowledge. There were storage systems for ritual materials, organized with the precision of a pharmaceutical archive. There were spaces for teaching, for communal gathering, for the specific practices that required particular configurations of participants. The larger communal structures had raised platforms at multiple heights, taking advantage of the vertical dimension in a way that reflected a lifetime of living in and around forest canopy. The Night Sisters made their own tools and weapons. The curved red lightsabers associated with Night Sister warriors were not manufactured off-world. They were constructed on Dathomir, the crystals sourced from within the planet's crust, the hilts crafted from materials available locally. The construction process was itself ritualized, tied into the magic tradition in ways that made the completed weapons slightly different from standard lightsabers in their force properties. The spell bottles were produced by specialist practitioners. The process of creating them was not simple. The glass was made from specific mineral combinations found on Dathomir. The magic sealed inside them had to be concentrated and fixed through a process that required sustained effort and specific ritual knowledge. A good spell bottle, properly made, could hold its charge for years. The clothing traditions of the Night Sisters were functional and culturally marked. The white robes worn after initiation had specific meaning. The additional garments worn during ritual practice were different from everyday wear and were treated with the care given to ritual objects. Body paint and markings were applied for specific occasions. The Night Sister appearance, as encountered in various Star Wars media, is not arbitrary aesthetic. Each element of what they wore and how they marked their bodies had a meaning within the tradition. After the massacre, after the community that had been drawing on and cycling through the planet's dark side energy for thousands of years was gone, the question becomes, what happened to that energy? It did not dissipate. Dark side concentrations of the magnitude that Dathomir had developed do not simply fade when the practitioners who worked within them are removed. Moraband was still a dark side world, thousands of years after the Sith had stopped using it as their primary base. The energy was in the ground, in the stone, in the accumulated history of what had been done there. Dathomir remained, after the massacre, one of the strongest dark side worlds in the galaxy. The unquiet dead added to it. The green mist continued to move through the ruins. The spirits that had been accessible through ritual practice remained accessible, though less reliably, to anyone force-sensitive who went there. This created something that was genuinely difficult to describe. A dark side world without a living tradition to contextualize it, to work with it, to maintain the relationship between the energy and a community of practitioners became something rawer. The Nightsisters had been a filter, in a sense, through which the planet's dark side energy passed and became something shaped and intentional. Without that filter, the energy was still there but less directed. Palpatine was aware of Dathomir's power. The Empire's intelligence services tracked dark-side worlds. Whether Palpatine made specific use of Dathomir's energy is not fully established in canon, but he was not unaware of what existed there. The world of Dathomir in the post-Clone Wars era became a strange attractor for Force-sensitive individuals who could feel what the planet held. Some came seeking power, some came seeking the Nightsister tradition, some came because the Force was pointing them there, and they did not fully understand why. Not all of them survived long enough to find what they were looking for. The Nightsister relationship with death was arguably the most significant philosophical difference between their tradition and both the Jedi and the Sith approaches. The Jedi relationship with death was one of acceptance and release. A Jedi who died properly became one with the Force. The individual dispersed, returned to the larger energy from which all life came. The most advanced Jedi practitioners could maintain some form of individuality after death as Force ghosts, but this was understood as exceptional, as a choice and an achievement, not as the default state. Attachment, including attachment to continued individual existence, was something the Jedi tried to release. The Sith relationship with death was one of refusal. Sith philosophy was built around the drive to overcome every limitation, and death was the ultimate limitation. Sith practitioners spent enormous effort trying to defeat it through essence transfer, through possessed artifacts, through the creation of Sith spirits that could persist after the body died, through the manipulation of midichlorians that Palpatine developed into something that could create and sustain life artificially. The Sith did not accept death. They fought it constantly and were generally consumed by the fight. The Nightsisters did something different. They accepted death as a transition rather than an ending. The dead did not stop being part of the community. They became a different kind of community member. One accessible under specific conditions, one whose knowledge remained available and whose protection of the living continued in a different form. This was not the desperate refusal of the Sith, which was about individual practitioners clinging to their own existence. This was a communal relationship with death, in which the dead remained resources for the living and the living maintained obligations toward the dead. Reanimation within this framework was not a horror. It was the most extreme expression of a relationship that was, in lesser forms, normal. If the spirits of the dead could be communicated with, if their knowledge was still accessible, if the boundary between living and dead was genuinely permeable in the way Dathomir made it, then the question of whether a dead body could be temporarily animated was a practical question rather than a moral one. The Jedi found it horrifying because it violated their acceptance doctrine. The Sith found it useful, but did not develop it the same way because it was communal, and communal is not what the Sith were good at. The Nightsisters found it simply part of what was possible on their world. When Luke Skywalker began rebuilding the Jedi Order after the fall of the Empire, he did so with a different philosophy than the old order had held. He was interested in Force traditions outside the narrow Jedi framework. He sought out practitioners of different paths. He did not require everyone who came to him to abandon what they already knew and start from the Jedi doctrinal baseline. This openness created space for Nightsister knowledge to potentially enter the restored tradition in some form. Whether any Nightsister practitioners or their recorded knowledge reached Luke's new Jedi Order is not documented clearly. What is known is that Luke was aware of Dathomir and what it represented, and that his approach to the dark side was more nuanced than the old orders had been. There were Night Sister Force users in the New Republic era. The tradition was not extinct, it was fragmented and scattered, carried by individuals without the community structure that would have allowed it to fully reconstitute. But the knowledge survived in pockets, in isolated practitioners, in whatever Merrin maintained and passed on. The longer-term fate of the Night Sister tradition in Star Wars lore is still being established. The sequel trilogy era and the material set in the New Republic period contain references and appearances that suggest the Night Sisters as a cultural entity had some form of continuation. Whether that continuation reached the point of a genuine restored community or remained dispersed practitioners is a question the ongoing story is in the process of answering. What is not in question is that the tradition mattered. It influenced too many of the major figures of the prequel and Clone Wars era to be dismissed as a footnote. Maul existed because of it. Ventress was shaped by it. Talzin was the single most politically significant dark side leader of the Clone Wars period who was not affiliated with either the Sith or the Republic. The Night Sisters were not peripheral to the story. They were running through the center of it. If you have made it this far, you already know this channel does not do surface level. Subscribe and turn on notifications so you do not miss the next deep dive. There is a lot more lore where this came from, and we are just past the halfway point. The most underrated aspect of Talzin's story is not her magic. It is her political intelligence. She operated inside a galaxy-spanning war with the largest military forces in galactic history pointed at each other. She was the leader of a small community on a backwater planet that most people in the core worlds could not locate on a star chart. She had no fleet, she had no army in the conventional sense, she had no political seat in any governing body. By every conventional measure, she was irrelevant to the conflict, but she maneuvered Dooku briefly. She positioned Savage Opress as a variable inside the separatist command structure. She located and restored her son, who then proceeded to build a criminal empire across the Outer Rim that became its own complication for the Republic. She constructed a plan to capture Dooku himself, which came closer to succeeding than anyone gave her credit for. She survived, at least for a time, the deliberate military annihilation of her community. None of this was luck. None of it was improvised in the moment. Talzin maintained a long memory. She held her goals across years and decades without losing track of them or allowing urgency to make her reach before she was ready. The patience she displayed, the ability to wait, to build, to work through intermediaries, to sacrifice positions in the short term in order to preserve options in the long term, was the kind of intelligence that the Sith in theory aspired to and in practice frequently abandoned when their anger got the better of them. The irony is that the emotional discipline Talzin displayed would have been recognizable to a master Jedi. The philosophical framework was completely different, but the practical capacity to subordinate immediate emotional reaction to longer strategic purpose looked similar from the outside. She was not serene about it the way the Jedi ideal demanded. She was cold. There is a difference. Her ultimate failure was against an opponent who had spent longer planning than she had. Sidious had been working his plan for decades before Talzin was even aware of his larger design. When she finally moved openly against Dooku, she was drawing Sidious's attention directly onto herself in a way she could not sustain. He was the stronger player. He had more pieces on the board. He moved to eliminate her not because he feared her in the moment, but because she was a variable that his calculation could not tolerate. The final confrontation between Talzin and Sidious, with Dooku also present, ended with Talzin's death. She did not die begging. She did not die broken. She died holding Dooku's heart in her hand with the Force. Had Grievous not intervened, She was one intervention away from taking the goal she had been working toward for years. That she did not achieve it does not diminish what she built. A closer look at the specific tools and techniques of Night Sister practice. The spell bottles were small glass containers that held concentrated magic. They could be used as delivery mechanisms for specific effects: sleep, pain, disorientation. Warriors carried them into battle and shattered them against opponents or against surfaces to release the effect. The Night Sister with combat experience knew how to use them with precision, shattering a bottle at a specific angle to direct the discharge. The ichor, the green substance visible in many Night Sister rituals, was the medium through which magic was expressed physically. It was not a chemical substance in any conventional sense. It was a manifestation of the force energy that saturated Dathomir, drawn out and made visible through ritual practice. A skilled Night Sister could use it to create solid constructs. Talzin's gold weapons were hers. The reanimation rituals coated the dead bodies in it before animation began. The ritual chants were functional, not purely ceremonial. The specific words and cadences had effects. The Night Sisters were very precise about this. An initiate who learned a chant incorrectly learned it again until she had it right, because incorrect phrasing produced incorrect results, or worse, uncontrolled release of whatever was being channeled. The connection to animal life on Dathomir, particularly to rancors, ran through a specific Night Sister discipline that could broadly be called bonding. A Night Sister who bonded with a rancor had a genuine force connection with the animal, not domination, not control in the sense of overriding the animal's nature, but communication and attunement. A rancor bonded to a Night Sister would act with coordination alongside her in a way that an unbonded rancor would not. The rancor still had its own impulses and its own limits. The bond extended those limits and gave the Night Sister a measure of influence. This relationship was one of the reasons the Night Sisters were not simply wiped out earlier by the planet's fauna. The most dangerous animals on Dathomir were, for the Night Sisters, neighbors rather than threats. A Night Brother without bonding capability had to rely on strength and weapons to survive rancor contact. A Night Sister had other options. The healing magic was real and was capable of treating injuries that standard medical technology would have struggled with. Talzin restored Maul's fractured mind through a variant of this. She treated Night Sister warriors between battles. The healing practices were passed down as carefully as the combat ones, because a community that lived in an environment as hostile as Dathomir needed both. This section requires careful handling because the accounts of what the Night Sisters communicated with are ambiguous in ways that appear deliberate. The Night Sister tradition held that the spirits of dead practitioners remained accessible to the living, held within the planet itself, within the green mist and the dark side saturation that made Dathomir what it was. These spirits were not described as trapped, they were described as continuing. The boundary between living and dead was porous, and the Night Sisters regarded this as normal. From a Force perspective, this maps imperfectly onto what the Jedi knew. Jedi Force ghosts were the result of specific training, a technique that allowed a practitioner to preserve consciousness after physical death. Not every Jedi could do it. It required knowledge that had to be learned from someone who already had it. Qui-Gon Jinn learned it. He passed elements of the knowledge to Yoda, who passed it to Kenobi. What the Night Sisters described sounded different. It sounded less like individual consciousness preserved by technique and more like something that Dathomir accumulated. The planet held onto its dead. Whether those dead retained identity in any meaningful sense, whether what the Night Sisters were actually communicating with was actual preserved consciousness or an echo of it or something else entirely, was never resolved. What is clear is that the communications were functional. Information passed from the spirits to the living. That information was sometimes accurate and useful. Whatever the nature of the entities involved, they were not simply imagination. The winged goddess and the fanged god, the two spiritual figures of the Night Sister tradition, were either representations of the Force's two aspects or were themselves specific entities of enormous power, ancestors of the tradition so ancient that they had become something more. The Night Sisters did not treat them as metaphors. They treated them as real and addressable. Rituals performed in their names had effects that could be observed. Over the centuries during which Dathomir was known to the Republic and then the Empire, the official responses ranged from indifference to active hostility. The quarantine was the earliest and most enduring policy. The Republic did not want to deal with Dathomir. The planet was not strategically valuable. The population was small. The resources were not exceptional. Putting Dathomir behind a navigational barrier and forgetting about it was the convenient option, and it remained the convenient option for a very long time. Jedi interaction with Dathomir was complicated by the obvious fact that the Night Sister magic was a dark side tradition. The Jedi Code had no category for a dark side tradition that was also a coherent culture with healing practices and community bonds and knowledge passed through generations. The Sith were enemies. The Night Sisters did not map onto that. They were not trying to dominate the galaxy. They were not pursuing Sith ideology. They were living on their planet, doing what their tradition told them to do. Some of what they did looked villainous from a Jedi perspective. Some of it looked simply alien. The handful of Jedi who engaged with Dathomir seriously came away with mixed conclusions. Some argued that the Night Sisters were a dark side threat that should be monitored or even preemptively dealt with. Others argued that what Dathomir represented was a legitimate alternative Force tradition that the Order should study rather than condemn. The Council characteristically preferred not to take a strong position either way and avoided the question through inaction. The Empire had simpler policies. The Empire had simpler policies about everything. Dathomir was a planet with Force-sensitive humans who were not under Imperial control. That made it a threat by definition. Imperial attention to Dathomir during the Galactic Civil War era was not friendly. The massacre left Dathomir in ruins. The Night Sister community was gone in any functional sense. But not every practitioner died in the assault. Merrin was one of the survivors. She appears in the game Jedi Fallen Order, which takes place about 5 years after Order 66 and the establishment of the Empire. She was young when the massacre happened, young enough that she did not have the full command of Night Sister magic that an adult practitioner would have had. What she had was enough to survive. She hid. She watched the village burn. She watched the women she had grown up with die. In the years that followed, she stayed on Dathomir. She had nowhere to go. She did not know how to leave, and she was not certain she would be safer anywhere else. She lived among the ruins. She practiced what she remembered of the magic. The dead that still lay on the ground of Dathomir, those who had not been fully released, she tended to in her way. When Cal Kestis arrived on Dathomir as part of his search for a Jedi holocron, the encounter between them was not friendly at first. Merrin had been told by the only person who had stayed on the planet with her, a fallen Jedi named Taran Malicos, that the Jedi were responsible for what happened to her sisters. This was a lie. Malicos was manipulating her. The massacre was Dooku's order and Grievous's execution. No Jedi were involved. But Merrin had no reason not to believe him, and the hatred it generated was real and functional because she had real grief driving it. When the truth about Malicos came out, everything shifted. The person she had believed was the last trustworthy figure in her life had been lying to her. The people she had been directing her rage at were not the ones responsible. She had been pointed in the wrong direction by someone who needed her anger aimed elsewhere. The resolution of that, The moment of redirection is one of the quieter, powerful character moments in the game. Merrin did not collapse. She did not have a dramatic breakdown. She simply looked at the situation with what she had and made a new decision. She killed Malicos. She helped Cal. She left Dathomir. She joined the crew of the Mantis as a combatant and as the closest thing to a Night Sister elder still operating in the galaxy. She was in her early 20s at the point in the story. She was the last practitioner with training, however incomplete, in a tradition thousands of years old. Merrin's magic was combat-focused, which reflected both her incomplete training and the circumstances of her survival. She could use the green teleportation ability that was distinctive to Night Sister practice, appearing and disappearing in bursts of green mist. She could conjure and project Ichor as offensive force. She could not reanimate the dead at the scale Talzin could. Not yet, but the capability was there in nascent form. What made her genuinely interesting as a character was the combination of practical skill and total loss. She was the last of something. She was young enough that she did not have the full body of what the Night Sisters knew. She was carrying a tradition in partial form, trying to keep it alive in her own practice while moving through a galaxy that had just spent years dismantling everything it could find. In Jedi Survivor, the follow-up game, Merrin continued to develop. She remained one of the most capable people in Cal's group. Her arc had moved from isolated and betrayed towards something that looked more like a person who had rebuilt around the loss rather than simply survived it. She was not the last Night Sister in lore, strictly speaking. The post-Clone Wars era, particularly in material set during the New Republic period, has seen Night Sister survivors and returnees, but she was the most developed of them in the storytelling, and she was the character who kept the Night Sister tradition from existing only as history. The question of whether the Night Sisters were truly dark side practitioners or something else is one that Star Wars lore circles have argued about for years, and it is worth engaging directly. The Jedi framing placed them firmly on the dark side. The energy they used came from a dark side concentration. Their more dramatic practices, reanimation, transformation, the predatory elements of their political dealings fit the general category of dark side behavior as the Jedi understood it. The Sith, from the other direction, would not have recognized the Night Sisters as genuine dark side practitioners. The Sith philosophy was about personal power, about the individual will overcoming all limitation. The Night Sister tradition was communal. It was about the clan, the mother, the shared practice passed down. The emotional engine driving the Sith was passion in the service of individual ambition. The emotional engine driving the Night Sisters was something closer to devotion, to the community, to the tradition, to the planet. This distinction actually matters. The Sith consumed their apprentices. They killed each other. The tradition was about producing one dominant practitioner through a process of constant elimination. The Night Sisters maintained a community over thousands of years by passing knowledge down. Those are not the same thing. What the Night Sisters were, most accurately, was a third thing. A Force tradition that drew on dark side energy without subscribing to either the Jedi or the Sith philosophy. Their ethics were their own. By those ethics, what they did was not evil. By Jedi ethics, much of it was. The mismatch was one of cultural frameworks as much as metaphysical fact. The reanimation of the dead is worth sitting with specifically. From a Jedi perspective, disturbing the dead, refusing to let the Force disperse naturally, was a violation. The dead belonged to the Force. You did not drag them back. The Night Sisters did not see it that way. Their tradition said the dead remained accessible. Their tradition said the dead could still serve the community that had raised them. Whether that is dark side corruption or a legitimate alternative theology about what death means in a Force-saturated world, is a question the lore does not answer definitively. The honest answer is that it is probably both. The Night Sister practice genuinely did draw on dark side energy, and that energy genuinely did have costs and effects that a Jedi Master would have identified as corrupting. But the tradition also sustained a community in one of the most hostile environments in the Outer Rim for thousands of years, which is not what typical dark side corruption looks like. Most things saturated in the dark side degrade, become unstable, lose coherence over time. The Night Sisters did not. They maintained. They passed things down. Something in their relationship with the power they used was different from the Sith relationship. After his restoration, Maul was not the Sith apprentice he had been. He was something new, and he was figuring out what that meant. His first project was reconnecting with Savage. His second was building something. The criminal enterprise he assembled in the Outer Rim, which eventually became an organization called the Shadow Collective, drew in the Pike Syndicate, Death Watch, and the Black Sun at different points. This was not Sith behavior. This was a man using what he had available, which happened to include Force ability and a reputation built on genuine lethality, to build a power base on his own terms. Maul knew Sidious did not want him. He was not confused about that. He had been replaced. He was not going back to that relationship. What he was trying to do in the somewhat chaotic way of someone who had spent years with a fragmented mind and was still reassembling himself was find a way to matter that did not depend on someone else's plan for him. The Shadow Collective had a moment of genuine power. At its height, Maul controlled Mandalore, had criminal networks across multiple sectors, and was doing actual damage to the Republic's ability to maintain order in the Outer Rim. And then Sidious came to check on what his former weapon was building. The fight between Sidious and both Maul and Savage was one of the more extraordinary things the Clone Wars animated series produced. Sidious was not threatened. He was assessing and then demonstrating. He killed Savage with the casual efficiency of someone removing an inconvenience. He defeated Maul and then kept him alive, which was the more disturbing part. He kept Maul alive because Maul was useful as bait. Talzin would come for her son. Sidious could use that. The trap worked. Talzin came. She came inside Dooku and Grievous, which is a sentence that requires explanation. She used the surrogate technique to possess Dooku at range and moved through him toward the confrontation. The physical confrontation between Talzin in that form and Sidious was the final one between them. She died there. She died fighting. She turned what was supposed to be Dooku's death into her own sacrifice, switching the target in the last moment and protecting Maul's escape. The maternal love in that act was real, and it was consistent with everything she had done since Sidious took her son decades earlier. All of the patience, all of the maneuvering, all of the careful play came down to one moment where she had an opportunity to protect him, and she took it without hesitation. Maul, for his part, carried that. He did not have a clean emotional relationship with what his mother had done. He barely knew her. He had lived his whole life without knowing she existed. She had restored his mind and then entered his story as a figure of enormous significance and then died for him before he had any time to understand what that meant. His grief for her, visible at the end of the Lawless episode, was one of the few moments in his arc where the armor cracked. The planet itself did not stop being what it was. The dark side concentration that made Dathomir dangerous did not require Night Sister practitioners to sustain it. It was older than the Night Sisters. It would persist after them. The ruins of the village became something almost archaeological. The bodies of fallen Night Sisters, not properly released through the rituals that would have let them pass, remained in a state of unrest. This is part of what Merrin was managing when Cal arrived. The dead were not at peace. The trauma of the massacre had created a situation where the force energy of Dathomir was caught on all of it, cycling around the grief and the violence without resolution. When Cal helped Merrin deal with Malachus, and then the two of them addressed what had been done to the dead, there was a release, not a full one. Dathomir did not become a gentle planet, but the specific weight of the unresolved massacre lifted somewhat. Later in the lore, there were efforts by surviving Nightsisters and Force-sensitive individuals drawn to the planet to begin rebuilding something. None of these efforts achieved anything like what had existed before the massacre. The knowledge base was too damaged. The community was too scattered. What could be rebuilt was a shadow of what had been there. Whether the Nightsister tradition can genuinely be restored, or whether it will persist only as fragments carried by individual practitioners, is something the current Star Wars story has not fully answered. The High Republic era material and the material set in the New Republic period both contain Nightsister elements, which suggests the tradition did not vanish entirely even across the larger galactic timeline. The High Republic, set roughly 200 years before the events of the Phantom Menace, contains some of the earliest canonically established contact between the wider galaxy and Dathomir. High Republic Jedi who encountered Nightsister activity described experiences consistent with what would be documented more thoroughly during the Clone Wars. The green magic, the connection to death, the communal practice. The tradition was already old during the High Republic era. What is significant about the High Republic appearances is that they demonstrate the Nightsisters were not a product of Clone Wars era circumstances. They were not created by the political situation of the late Republic or by Sidious's machinations. They were there doing what they did, centuries before any of that. The High Republic Jedi response to Nightsister contact during this era was generally one of caution rather than hostility. There were Jedi in the High Republic who advocated more engagement with non-standard Force traditions, more curiosity, and less condemnation. Some of those Jedi had direct contact with Dathomir. None of this materially changed the trajectory of either group. The Nightsisters remained isolated. The Jedi remained a hierarchical order with specific doctrines about the dark side. But it suggests that there were moments in the history where a different relationship was possible. Pain was not something the Nightsister tradition tried to eliminate from the practitioner's experience. This is one of the more uncomfortable truths about the training, and it is easy to misread as simple cruelty. It was not. It was a deliberate philosophical position rooted in what the tradition understood about how the magic worked. The Force, as the Jedi understood it, was something to be approached with calm and clarity. Emotion was considered interference. A Jedi who acted from fear or anger or grief was a Jedi in danger of losing access to the most constructive dimensions of the Force and drifting toward the destructive ones. The Jedi trained serenity specifically because serenity was functional within their framework. The Nightsisters operated on a different understanding. They drew on the same energy the Jedi called the dark side, and that energy was not indifferent to emotional state. It responded to it, not by clouding judgment the way the Jedi feared, but by amplifying capacity. A Nightsister in physical pain, in grief, in the specific kind of cold fury that followed loss, had more access to the ichor, not less. The emotional state opened something rather than closing it. The training regimen that initiates went through was designed partly to teach this, to show young practitioners that pain was not the end of function, that grief did not disable, that fear could be acknowledged and moved through rather than avoided. A Nightsister who had never been in pain was a Nightsister who had not been tested. And an untested practitioner was one who might discover in the worst possible moment that she could not function under the conditions the magic actually worked best within. This had costs that were real. Practitioners who trained heavily in pain-adjacent techniques developed a relationship with their own suffering that looked, from the outside, like masochism or damage. It was neither in the clinical sense, but it was also not psychologically neutral. The Nightsisters were not gentle people. Their relationship with hardship was direct and unsentimentalized in ways that made them difficult to be close to for outsiders who had not gone through the same training. What the training produced, in its most successful outcomes, was practitioners who were genuinely unbreakable under conditions that broke others. A Nightsister warrior who was wounded in battle did not stop. A Nightsister practitioner who lost a clan member did not collapse. They kept moving, kept working, kept drawing on whatever the situation was generating in them and converting it into capability. That was the intended outcome. In most cases, it was the actual outcome. In some cases, the training produced something more damaged than intended. The line between learning to function through pain and learning to seek it out was not a wide one, and individuals who had been pushed too hard in the wrong direction crossed it. The tradition had protocols for identifying when that had happened and for redirecting practitioners who were developing unhealthy relationships with their own training. But the protocols were not perfect, and the population of Nightsisters across the full history of the tradition included practitioners who had slipped past the protocols. The transformation performed on Savage Opress was one of the Nightsister tradition's most demanding workings, and the way it was performed on him was not the way it was intended to be used. In the full context of the tradition, transformation rituals had protocols. The subject was supposed to enter with consent and preparation. There were specific pre-ritual practices meant to stabilize the body and mind before the working began. The practitioner performing the transformation was supposed to maintain active attunement with the subject throughout the process, reading his physical state and adjusting the working's intensity in response. What Talzin did with Savage was truncated. She had a deadline. She needed a weapon quickly. She performed the ritual under time pressure with a subject who had partial consent at best. He knew he was going to be transformed. He did not know what that meant in practice. He had not been prepared. The pre-ritual stabilization was abbreviated. The result was effective in the narrow sense. Savage emerged with the enhanced size and strength and aggression that Talzin intended, but the transformation was not clean. The process cracked something in him that a properly executed ritual would not have cracked. The aggression that was supposed to be enhanced became something less controllable. The sensitivity that might have been preserved through proper preparation was gone. Savage after the transformation was a different kind of person than Savage before it. Not in the surface sense of size and capability, but in the deeper sense of who he was when he was not fighting. He had been, by the accounts of Night Brothers who knew him before, someone with genuine warmth toward his brother Maul, and a measured intelligence that his physical intimidation obscured. After the transformation, the warmth was still there in fragments, but the intelligence was less available, and the control over his aggression was damaged. He was aware of this at some level. He could feel the difference between who he had been and who he was, without having the capacity to bridge it. That awareness, that sense of having been altered beyond what you consented to, was its own form of suffering that he carried through the rest of his short life. Talzin knew the transformation was imperfect. She was not unaware of what the time pressure had cost. But her calculation was that an imperfectly transformed Savage was still more useful to her purpose than an untransformed one, and her purpose was served. That calculation was correct in the tactical sense and troubling in the ethical sense, and the Nightsister tradition had to live with both of those being true simultaneously. What happened during the selection process for the warrior who would become Dooku's new apprentice was more elaborate and more brutal than the brief account in the Clone Wars series fully conveyed. Talzin began by consulting the Spirit Network. She asked specific questions about what kind of practitioner Dooku needed. about what qualities would serve her larger purpose, about which Night Brother lineage was most likely to produce someone who could both serve Dooku's immediate needs and survive long enough to be useful for Talzin's longer game. The spirits gave her parameters rather than a name. The parameters narrowed her focus. She then sent word to the Night Brother village. The selection was presented as a competition for a position of honor, which was accurate as far as it went. What was not disclosed was that the position involved transformation, that the transformation carried risks, or that the primary criterion Talzin was using was not combat excellence in isolation, but a specific combination of physical capability, force sensitivity at a level below what most Night Brothers exhibited, and a particular kind of psychological resilience that she needed for what she intended to put the selected warrior through. The competition itself ran over several days. The tests were not purely combat. They included endurance challenges, navigation through sections of the Dathomir forest under controlled conditions designed to produce specific types of stress, and a final direct combat sequence. Night Brothers were eliminated at each stage. Several were injured seriously enough to require medical attention. 2 died. Savage won not by being the most aggressive competitor, though his physical capability was genuinely exceptional. He won because in the final stage, when the test was designed to push past exhaustion into something closer to desperation, he maintained a quality of deliberate decision-making that the more purely aggressive competitors lost. He was brutal when brutality was needed. He was also capable of pausing, of reading the situation, of choosing his moment, rather than simply driving forward regardless of what the situation required. That quality was exactly what Talzin's parameters had identified. A purely aggressive warrior would burn out under Dooku's demanding service, or would do something impulsive that ended the arrangement too quickly. She needed someone who could sustain the role for long enough to be useful. Savage had that capacity. After he was selected and separated from the other competitors, he was brought to the Night Sister village. He had never been inside it before. The spatial separation between the Night Brother and Night Sister communities meant that even the most accomplished Night Brother warriors had limited direct knowledge of what the village was like. He walked into it as someone walking into a foreign country. What he experienced there, in the time between selection and transformation, was a compressed version of what Night Sister initiates experienced over much longer periods. He was shown things that the Night Brothers were not normally shown. He was exposed to the spirit communication in limited form. He was told something, not everything, about what was going to happen to him. Whether the partial disclosure was sufficient to constitute genuine consent was a question that did not get asked within the tradition, because the tradition had frameworks for this kind of working that did not include consent as a primary criterion. The warrior had been selected. He had competed. He had won. His presence in the village was the acknowledgement of what came next. By Night Sister logic, that was enough. By any external standard, it was not. But Dathomir was not operating by external standards. Beyond the animated series and the video games, the Night Sisters appear across a range of comic and novel material that adds dimensions to the lore not visible in the primary screen media. The novel Dark Disciple, written by Christie Golden based on unproduced Clone Wars scripts, is where Ventress's final arc was told. What it added to the Night Sister story was the most complete picture available of what Ventress was like after her time on Dathomir, how the identity she found there persisted and developed through the years of her independent operation. She was not performing being a Night Sister. It had become something she actually was, in the way that genuine identity works rather than assumed roles. Her interactions with Quinlan Vos in that novel showed a woman who was capable of real intimacy without having lost the hardness that her history had produced. She trusted him, which was remarkable given what her history with trust looked like. She trusted him while being fully aware that trust was the thing that had hurt her most consistently throughout her life. She chose it anyway. That choice was the most Night Sister thing about her by the end. The willingness to move into something difficult with full awareness of what it cost. The Dr. Aphra comics introduced a Dathomirian who operated in the criminal margins of the galaxy, carrying fragments of the tradition in a context that had nothing to do with the Night Sister community structures. What that material explored was what the tradition looked like when stripped entirely of its communal context, when a single individual was carrying pieces of it through situations that had no relationship to the ritual calendar or the spirit network or the bonded rancors. It was a version of the Night Sister identity that existed on its own terms, not diminished exactly, but transformed by the circumstances into something portable and improvised. The High Republic novels that touched on Dathomir added historical depth, showing the tradition in an earlier form and showing how the Jedi of that era processed contact with it. The High Republic was a period of relative Jedi confidence and organizational strength, and that confidence shaped how its practitioners approached Dathomir, with more curiosity and less fear than the later order would have shown, but also with the same fundamental assumption that the Jedi framework was the correct one through which to evaluate what the Night Sisters were doing. That assumption was always the limiting factor. Every outside account of the Night Sisters, from every era, was filtered through a framework that was not the Night Sisters' own. What would the tradition have looked like, described from within, without the translation into the Jedi or Sith or Republic or Imperial lens? That version did not survive. It lived on Dathomir, in the oral tradition, and the oral tradition died in the massacre. When Sidious defeated Maul and Savage on Mandalore, he made a choice that was tactically odd from the outside. He had just comprehensively demonstrated his superiority over both of them. Killing them was well within his capability at that moment. He chose not to, at least not both of them. Savage died. Maul survived, captured, kept alive. The official reasoning, which Sidious did not articulate, but which his subsequent actions made clear, was that Maul alive was bait. Talzin would come for him. Sidious wanted Talzin drawn out. He had been managing the Night Sister situation for decades, and the approach had been to use rather than directly confront. But Talzin had become too active, too close to successfully interfering with his plans, too knowledgeable about his methods to be left operating. He needed her drawn out and ended. This calculation cost something that Sidious likely did not weight heavily, but which was real. Maul's captivity was genuinely terrible. The specifics of what Dooku and Sidious subjected him to during this period are not fully shown in the series, but the accounts are not gentle. He was a prisoner being used as bait, and the people holding him were not interested in his comfort. What this period produced in Maul was a specific kind of hardness that went beyond what Sidious's original training had created. He had been broken before, in the years after Naboo. He had been restored. Now he was being deliberately damaged again in a more controlled way, and he was aware of what was being done and why, which made it worse rather than better. Being broken through circumstances was one thing. Being deliberately maintained in a damaged state as a tactical resource was another. He carried this experience forward. Every account of Maul after the Mandalore capture and the events that followed showed a person who had moved past anger, in a sense, not into peace, but into a kind of cold that was its own thing. The rage was still there. It was just no longer hot. Cold rage is in many ways more functional than hot rage, and also more disturbing to be near. That coldness was the last gift Sidious gave him, unintentionally. In trying to use Maul as a tool, he produced someone who understood exactly what being used as a tool felt like from the inside, and who spent the rest of his life being very deliberate about not being in that position again. The question of what the Nightsisters might have become if the massacre had not happened is worth considering not as fantasy, but as context for understanding what was lost. A surviving Nightsister community, moving through the Imperial period with the same combination of isolation and capability that had kept it functioning for thousands of years, would have represented something the galaxy had almost nothing of. A living dark side tradition with no interest in galactic domination, with accumulated knowledge of Force use that the Sith had tried to destroy and the Jedi had tried to ignore, operating on its own terms in a corner of the Outer Rim. Talzin alive through the Imperial period was a scenario that Palpatine clearly found unacceptable. A mother of her ability, with the full community behind her, with the spirit network intact, with decades more of accumulated practice, was a variable that his control of the galaxy could not comfortably accommodate. She had already demonstrated that she could work around his plans at close range. An older and more experienced version of her was something he had no interest in encountering. The knowledge base the Nightsisters held, specifically around death and the Force, was knowledge that remained genuinely unique. No Sith practitioner had developed reanimation at the scale Talzin demonstrated. No Jedi had explored the permeable boundary between living and dead in the way Dathomir's specific conditions made possible. No outside Force tradition had the deep relationship with an individual dark side world's specific energy that the Nightsisters maintained through thousands of years of consistent practice. That knowledge was not recoverable from first principles. It required the specific conditions of Dathomir, the accumulated dead who remained in the spirit network, the transmission from living practitioners who had the full tradition rather than fragments of it. The window for any of that was closed when the village burned. What survived was not nothing. Merrin was not nothing. But the difference between a fragment of a tradition and the tradition itself was the difference between knowing a handful of words in a language and being able to think in it. The fragments allowed certain things. The full tradition allowed something else. That something else was gone, and the galaxy that destroyed it never noticed the loss, which was perhaps the most accurate measure of how much the galaxy understood about what had existed on that planet. The Nightsisters are a specific answer to a question that Star Wars often avoids asking directly. The question is, what does Force tradition look like when it develops without Jedi or Sith influence? The Jedi were organized, institutional, and philosophically shaped by the Old Republic's values. The Sith were the counter to that, defined in opposition. The Nightsisters had neither. They grew from exile, from isolation, from the specific conditions of Dathomir and the people who were left there with no contact and no guidance. What they became was entirely their own. The result was something that had genuine value and genuine darkness mixed together in ways that could not be simply separated. The healing traditions were real, the knowledge was real, the community bonds were real, the martial capabilities were real. So was the reanimation of the dead. So was the forced transformation of Night Brothers who did not fully consent to what was being done to them. So was the hierarchical control that kept half the population of Dathomir in a permanently subordinate position. That complexity is honest. It is more honest than a simple "they were the bad guys" reading. It is also more honest than a "they were just misunderstood" reading. The Nightsisters were what they were, a culture shaped by isolation and dark side saturation, with genuine achievements and genuine cruelties, with knowledge the rest of the galaxy could not reproduce and practices the rest of the galaxy would rightly find disturbing. Their destruction in the Clone Wars was not a resolution. It did not feel like justice. Dooku ordered it as a political convenience, and Grievous executed it because that was what he did. There was no moral weight to the act of destroying them. It was just power applied to a smaller power. The fact that Merrin survived, The fact that Talzin's legacy persisted through Maul, the fact that fragments of the tradition scattered across the galaxy through the few survivors, suggests that the Night Sisters were not simply ended, they were dispersed. What happens to those fragments over the longer timeline of Star Wars is still being written. After Sidious's demonstration on Mandalore and the events that followed, Maul spent the Clone Wars in a damaged state. His empire was gone. His brother was dead. His mother was dead. He had been kept alive by someone who viewed him as a mechanism rather than a person, and he had escaped that situation without being free from it. The Siege of Mandalore was where his path intersected again with Ahsoka Tano. He had invited that meeting deliberately. He wanted to offer her information about Sidious's plan. He wanted her to take that information to Anakin Skywalker. His reasoning was not altruistic. He wanted Anakin brought in because he had foreseen something about Anakin's connection to Sidious, and he wanted that specific confrontation to happen in a specific way. Ahsoka refused his offer. She had her own mission, and Maul's framing of it, essentially let me out and help me use Skywalker to end Sidious, was not something she could accept. What followed was a fight, a significant one. Two of the most capable Force users of their generation, in a battle that no one except the combatants was watching. Ahsoka captured him. The events of Order 66 interrupted what would have followed. In the chaos, Maul escaped. He went from there to Malachor, then eventually to Dathomir in a search for something, for meaning, for resolution, for whatever he was missing. The Dathomir return was not triumphant. It was a broken man going back to ruins. He communicated with the spirits there. He found, in the way that Force-sensitive people who go to Dathomir sometimes find things they were not expecting, what he was actually looking for. What he was looking for was to be done. His final confrontation with Obi-Wan Kenobi on Tatooine years later was short. 3 moves, roughly. A strike, a counter, a resolution. Maul died in Obi-Wan's arms. His last words were asking whether the one they were protecting, the child on that desert planet, would avenge them. Obi-Wan told him yes. Maul believed it. He died, by any reasonable reading, at peace. For a man who had been taken from his mother as an infant and trained by a monster and broken in half and put back together and broken again in different ways, dying on that desert, believing that something was going to be made right, was not nothing. It was not everything, but it was not nothing. The Night Sister tradition, measured purely by institutional survival, failed. The community was destroyed. The knowledge was scattered. The planet was left to its ruins and its unquiet dead. Measured by influence on galactic history, the calculus is different. Maul existed because of Dathomir and because of Talzin. Maul's existence as Sidious's first apprentice, and then as an independent operator, and then as the unwitting bait that drew Talzin into her death, and then as the person on Mandalore whose presence forced the confrontation that placed Ahsoka on the right ship at the wrong moment to survive Order 66. That thread ran through decades of history. Pull Maul from the timeline and multiple events downstream change. Ventress's arc, from Night Sister infant to Dooku's assassin to something closer to a person making her own choices, contained within it a small story about what happened when someone who had been made into a weapon found out they were something more than that. That story had nothing to do with the Jedi or the Sith. It was the story of one woman who survived a great deal of destruction and kept reorienting towards something. Merrin's continuation of the Night Sister tradition, in whatever form she maintained it, was a refusal of a different kind. She could have let the tradition die with her sisters. She did not. She carried it into a galaxy that was hostile to everything she represented, in the body of a young woman with incomplete training and complete determination. The Night Sisters were not the heroes of Star Wars. They were not the villains either, not cleanly. They were a people with a history, with things worth knowing and things worth questioning, with a connection to the Force that the galaxy at large never fully understood and largely failed to respect. That is a more interesting thing to be than simple. The Nightsisters of Dathomir built something in isolation that no other Force tradition managed to replicate. They kept it alive for thousands of years. They produced Maul. They produced Ventress. They produced Merrin. They produced Talzin, who was one of the most remarkable people in Star Wars history by any measure. And they did all of it on a planet the rest of the galaxy was happy to pretend did not exist. If you want to keep going down this road, subscribe and let the algorithm know what you want to see. We cover all of it: the lore the films skip, the histories that take more than 2 hours to tell properly, the characters who deserve more than a scene or a line. There is always more. There is always something darker and older and stranger underneath what we think we know about this galaxy. The Nightsisters are just one door. Hit subscribe. Stay curious.